The Tennessee General Assembly just passed GOA-sponsored legislation to expand the state's Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act. Basically, Tennessee just became a sanctuary for any firearms manufactured headquartered there from anti-gun legal attacks and monetary judgments nationwide. Anti-gunners want to sue gun companies into oblivion, but this GOA-backed bill will prevent them from collecting a dime. If companies just move headquarters or banking to Tennessee, they'll be protected from lawsuits like Remington went through in Connecticut, and gun stores went through in Maryland, and 80% gun manufacturers went through in Pennsylvania. GOA's bills sailed through both the Tennessee House and Senate with overwhelming majorities on April 15th, and currently awaits the governor's signature. So let's dive into this bill, really see what it does and how the anti-gun crowd is reacting. Hi, I'm Ben Sanderson, and you're watching the Minuteman Moment. But before we get into the video, I wanted to take a second to let you know about GOA's annual convention, Goals. The Gun Owners Advocacy and Leadership Summit is set to be held August 9th and 10th of this year in Knoxville, Tennessee. Come out and visit with some of your favorite manufacturers, participate in activism training, and hear from the top voices in the Second Amendment community. The best part? It's free for GOA members. So sign up today using the link in the description below. Okay, so now back to the video. Tennessee's legislature, meaning its House and Senate, worked together to pass HB 073 and SB 1360 into law on April 15th, 2025. The new legislation now awaits the governor's signature to become law in the volunteer state. The bill itself revolves around Tennessee's state version of the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act, also known as PLACA. PLACA is a federal law passed in 2005 to protect the firearms industry against the business-ending lawfare of the billionaire-funded anti-gun lobby. What the federal law does is immunize the firearms industry from third-party misuse of their products. It is not, as critics like to say, a blanket shield against any lawsuit whatsoever. In 2023, Tennessee passed its own version of PLACA, protecting firearms businesses from frivolous civil liability lawsuits in state court. Fast forward now to the present day. The GOA-backed bill passed the other day strengthens Tennessee's existing law, creating strong incentives for businesses to relocate their operations and their assets to Tennessee. The bill also adds a provision mandating that Tennessee state courts cannot recognize the anti-gun judgments of foreign courts that includes other countries and states. This means that if an anti-gun group or lawyer successfully sues a Tennessee business in another state, using the home field advantage of radical activist judges, Tennessee courts will refuse to enforce that judgment when the time comes to collect.
This bill simply builds on something we did a couple years ago, colleagues, providing firearms and manufacturers, dealers and sellers, some for protection from civil liability, including lawsuits from foreign entities. This legislation makes additions to the law that we did in 2023 that aligned with the Federal Protection of Lawful Commerce and Arms Act at the state level. These additions protect firearms manufacturers from foreign claims of civil liability, and foreign meaning not only foreign nations but other states. State courts would be blocked from recognizing foreign judgments. It also expands the list of manufacturers to which this legislation would apply. As many of you are aware, the country of Mexico has filed a lawsuit against Smith & Wesson and other American firearms manufacturers, claiming that they should be held accountable for the violent cartels that drive their drug trade. Most of us consider that ludicrous.
This is an incredibly smart move by Tennessee, and one that stands to continue to solidify the state as the place to be if you're in the firearms industry. Industry stalwarts like Beretta, Smith & Wesson, and others have already moved their operations out of anti-gun states like Maryland and Massachusetts to Tennessee. No doubt, this cutting-edge legislation will also serve as encouragement to other pro-gun states to pass their own versions of this law to protect their own domestic firearms manufacturers. We'd love to see Texas, Florida, Utah, Kansas, Montana, South Dakota, West Virginia, and other pro-gun states pass their own versions of this bill. But why should you care about having these protections for firearm companies? The reason being is that many of these attacks on the firearms industry have a nefarious purpose. They are attempts to disrupt the supply of firearms and disarm the public by throttling the Second Amendment supply chain, making the business environment for selling guns so hostile that no company would dare to sell you a gun in the first place. And even if you're not in the industry, just a regular old gun owner, not to worry, because this bill has something for you as well. It protects everyone who sells a firearm, even if you engage in a private sale and the buyer happens to use that firearm for evil purposes. By filing lawsuits against industry members in jurisdictions hostile to the Second Amendment, the anti-gunners have successfully advanced blatantly false theories of liability, which sympathetic state court judges, handpicked by lawyers like those at Brady and Everytown, who then claim the lawsuits fall outside the PLACA's protections. Recently, these ridiculous theories include that sales of firearms represent a public nuisance and that selling guns to eligible buyers constitutes negligent entrustment, negligence per se, and even that gun manufacturers should be dinged with what is known as market share liability, where you are held liable for a percentage of a judgment even if the plaintiff can't prove who sold the product. This, along with various violations of state consumer protection and advertising laws, have provided the radical left a cornucopia of baseless theories with which to harass the firearms industry. And honestly, when you're a lawyer whose goal it is to drive companies out of business, it doesn't really matter if you're successful. Even if you lose, you still force the Second Amendment industry to hemorrhage tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees. And as the saying goes, the punishment is the process. Famously, Remington was forced to pay out $73 million for violating Connecticut state's advertising law due to one of its rifles being used in the tragic Sandy Hook shooting. This strategy has become the game plan for the anti-gun lobby, teaming up with state legislatures to pass anti-gun bills designed from the ground up to circumvent PLACA. Examples of this include defining ordinary lawful activities like selling firearms parts as a public nuisance, a type of lawsuit usually reserved for chemical spills and toxic waste dumps. These laws are then exploited by anti-gun localities and state courts, creating a system that punishes firearm companies for simply engaging in the business. These tactics likely are in large part responses to the US Supreme Court's recent Second Amendment decisions. Since Heller's recognition of an individual's Second Amendment right, and Bruin's recognition of a broad right of Americans to bear arms, gun control advocates have realized that attacking individual rights is a losing strategy. They've realized if they can't prohibit the exercise of Second Amendment rights through legislative means, they can attack the supply of arms at its source, the Second Amendment industry. The goal is to drive members of the firearm industry out of business, making them legally liable for shootings and other violent crimes, seeking staggering monetary judgments as so-called remedies for these actions of third-party criminals with which those companies have nothing to do with. Such frivolous litigation would never stand up in any other context. But as we know, when it comes to firearms, the ordinary rules don't apply. But there's a silver lining, and it just began in Tennessee. Just as anti-gun jurisdictions are responsible for making the situation worse, pro-gun states have the opportunity to make it better. This is why we're so excited that Tennessee has decided to pass this law. This bill should serve as model legislation for other states to enact the same or similar protections of the Second Amendment. So, what specifically does this recently enacted bill do? First, the bill expands protections to additional entities, like individuals who privately sell firearms. Second, the bill adds additional categories, like suppressors and firearm magazines, to be protected. Indeed, firearms are not the only arms the Second Amendment protects. Third, the bill explicitly prohibits bad faith, public nuisance, and other novel theories of liability anti-gun litigants created, when litigants seek to use these theories in Tennessee courts. But most importantly, the proposed legislation would declare that this sort of frivolous anti-gun litigation in other states is against Tennessee's public policy to enforce, and would empower Tennessee state courts to refuse recognition of foreign state court judgments obtained elsewhere against domestic industry members. To that end, a foreign litigant seeking to enforce a foreign anti-gun judgment against a domestic industry member would be required to certify that judgment does not violate the state's public policy, and if they're wrong, then the anti-gun litigant would incur a penalty that is triple the foreign judgment, payable to the domestic industry member. And the penalty would run not only against the anti-gun litigant, but against its attorneys personally, i.e., lawyers for Everytown, Brady, Philadelphia, Baltimore, etc. How's that for a shot across the bow? This bill now awaits the governor's signature. We'll be watching to see what happens, and when this bill becomes law, we hope to see many states nationwide follow suit. Now, thanks for watching. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe to stay up to date with GOA's latest fights for your rights.